No, I just think I like what are for me some of the as I look back, some of the things that I used to lord power or hold power over students, right? Mm-hmm. Like grades would be one thing.
Yeah.
Homework, right? Mm-hmm. If you don't, then you will. Then right. This will happen to you.
Welcome to Hallway Conversations. We're a trio of educators who have plenty of questions about teaching and learning and school culture, and we believe in the value of reflection and collaboration as we seek to keep growing as teachers. This podcast is our place for thinking out loud together about issues in education and why they might matter to Christian educators. Welcome to the conversation.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 104th episode of the Hallway Conversations. My name's Matt Beamers.
I'm Abby DeGroat.
And I'm Dave Mulder.
Friends, we continue to be thankful to our friends over at the Center for the Advancement of Christian Education, also known as CASE, for their generous sponsorship of our podcast. Did you know that CASE is the home of the Teaching for Transformation framework and that over 90 schools currently in the United States have implemented it for teaching and learning? To learn more about TFT and other CASE resources, we encourage you to visit their website at www.cace.org. That's www.case.org, and see how they might support you and your school community. Friends, I also want to make you aware that this past week, the Dort Masters of Education hosted a webinar on recruiting and retaining teachers. And if you'd like a recording of that, please email us at hallwayconvospod@gmail.com. That's hallwayconvospod@gmail.com. In addition, in late March, early April, we'll be hosting a webinar with Dr. Owen Webb on restorative practices. We'll share more details about that when we have them, but we hope you consider joining us. We'll put a link in the show notes when we have more information.
That's right.
Dave and Abby, sometimes our check-ins are related to the topic at hand, and sometimes they're simply to find ways to share who we are with our listeners. Today is a little bit more of the latter, I think.
Okay.
So it's a bit of a random check-in question.
I don't know what this is going to be. I'm a little nervous.
You should be.
Excellent.
And bonus points for anyone who can tie in the check-in question to the topic that we're going to talk later. So here it is. What is one fashion trend from your youth that you absolutely embraced? And if you're honest, you might even miss just a little bit. Maybe you don't miss it at all. But what's one, Abigail, what is one fashion trend from your youth, teenage years, early 20s, not that long ago?
Okay. I'm going to go with, so I was very much like a late 90s, early 2000s.
Thank you for reminding us.
Baby,
Yep.
right? So that was the high school era that I was in. If you all probably can do the math and know how old I am then. But I'm going to go with, like, I really loved my Doc Martens and, like, my rugby shirts with the rubber buttons.
That's right.
And right?
Rugby shirts.
Yes. And my sister and I, and sometimes my friends, will look back at our pictures of when we were in high school, and we were these tiny little things with these huge clothes.
Yeah. That's
like,
right.
why on earth did we buy everything in an extra large when we weighed like 98 pounds? And so I kind of like a baggy shirt now too. So I'm like on trend, but I really loved my Doc Martens and my rugby.
That's
shirts.
great.
Friends, if we can somehow get a photo of Abby from the early 90s.
Nobody do it. I know who you are. You will not share.
Please send it hallwayconvospod@gmail.com. That's hallwayconvospod. Dave, how are you?
I hope my sister doesn't listen to this.
So as soon as you said that, I'm thinking back to, I love that the 90s are back, baby, because there's that whole thing. And so, like, my go-to look when I think about high school and college was I was wearing flannel all the time. And not that I was so grunge, but, like, I aspired to be, and I'm back wearing flannels all the time again.
I love it.
It's been great, but
love the flannel.
That's right.
Cannot get enough of the flannel.
He has some on right now, actually.
Flannels every day from basically October to March, which is about winter in Iowa. I would say mullet.
Oh, that's right.
2 earrings.
Stop it! You're not gonna like aspire to the mullet.
Don't. Test me.
You should see the look these students share, you guys.
It's hilarious.
The youngest child comes out every time Abby talks to me. It's just like, I want to do the opposite. 2 earrings, at times rolled up pants.
Oh, yeah.
Miami Vice neon colors, so you can figure out how old I am.
I was there too. I remember those.
And do you remember? I remember going through, I don't even know what they're called, but like the little biker hats with the flipped up front? I had a couple of those, biker, almost like little painter hats or something. I don't know. I went through
It was a look.
It was a look. And I was just had all these random
Speaking
looks.
of photographs.
Yeah, that would, wow. The mullet. Hockey hair is what we called it in Canada. So
There are kids with mullets again.
I know, and I am so jealous. I'm just like, man, that looks so good. I want to take that head of hair and just like put it on my head and go skate around the ice coming out of the back of my helmet. Oh, that is marvelous. That would be amazing.
Something.
That's not nothing.
Definitely not nothing.
Dave, I think you have the topic at hand, so we're going to make a bit of a hard right turn here.
Let's see if
as I try to get the image of Doc Martens and extra large rugby shirts out of my head.
I had the sandals and the shoes. Anyone else remember the sandals too? The leather ones with the straps. Yeah.
I had the blue and white striped rugby shirt is the one. Yeah. They were usually like color blocks.
Yeah, it's good stuff.
Wow.
So preppy.
I'm going to try to recover. I'm going to try to recover from seeing those things in my head. Dave, why don't you help us out here?
So I've been thinking, and I don't really know what to attribute this to exactly, but I've been thinking lately about the nature of power in the classroom. And maybe I'm trying to make a connection to our apparel choices and power, and I got nothing.
The rugby shirt is a power move. It's a power move.
But I'm holding in my hand here one of my favorite books. I know you both have read this one too, On Christian Teaching, Practicing Faith in the Classroom by David I. Smith.
So good.
And yeah, I've read this book at least half a dozen times, and every time I reread it, I find something new and something that just captures my imagination all over again. And in his chapter it's titled Designing Space and Time, and he talks about all kinds of aspects of how we use space in classrooms and how we use time in our teaching practice. But he has a bit in here that raises my question about power, I think. And I'd just like to read a section of it to you, and then we'll think out loud maybe a little bit about the nature of power in the classroom. So this is from page 117 of the book. And he's talking about, the nature of how power exhibits in spaces in which we teach. And here's a bit I'll read. In his nuanced account of his ethnographic research at an urban Catholic junior high school, Peter McLaren describes the point at which he began to speculate that every teacher has a power spot. He describes the power spot as the place in the classroom to which the teacher tended to retreat when he or she felt threatened or unsure. This position represented their authority in some way and reinforced their feeling of being in charge. The actual location varied from teacher to teacher. It might be behind the lectern or beside a desk or out in front of the class, but they all seemed to have one. Moreover, their power spot seemed to become a feature of the space in which they taught. McLaren noticed that when teachers exchanged classes, they would tend to go to the power spot of the teacher whose class they'd taken over.
That's fascinating.
Isn't it interesting?
That is so fascinating.
Yeah.
Oh, here it gets better. One day, a teacher asked McLaren to briefly take over his class while he was busy preparing a projector in another room. McLaren found himself in charge, and he describes what ensued. So here's the story. I wandered around the room watching the kids do their seat work, and as soon as I approached the teacher's power spot, the noise began to dim. But when I actually entered the power spot, one of the kids shot up his hand. Are you the teacher now? Well, not exactly, I said, because I want to know if I can get a drink. Sure, go ahead.
Wow.
Right. And so because he's in the spot, suddenly he is viewed as having the teacher's power and authority. And all of this just gets me thinking about, like, what is power in the classroom? What's the nature of power in the classroom? Who has power in the classroom? Because sometimes I think it's the teacher, and sometimes I think it's the students, and sometimes it's somewhere in between.
Yeah, I've seen both.
Well, right. Yeah. And so I guess that's just where I'd like us to start. Like, what does power look like in classrooms, and why should we care about this, I guess?
Thoughts, Abby? What's rolling through your mind, or as you're either in your work now, or even as you think back at your time as a high school English teacher?
Yeah, I think I think the more, like, thinking about power spots and the need to almost exert, or when you're feeling uncertain and exerting power, I think as a young teacher, like, I taught 18-year-olds as a 22-year-old.
Right.
And there were definitely times where I know I had to resort to, like, a spot or an office, right, where I needed to, I felt like, assert power in ways that I didn't have it naturally, right? So, like, almost against students. And I think as I had more experience and had more natural clout or respect or like authority
You've
with
established
them,
yourself
right,
differently.
as I knew more things, as I interacted differently, I think my need to exert power lessened, right? The more that I actually had it naturally. But I think I did have to, or thought I had to, or tried to exert it through, like, artificial or, you know, I don't know, artificial ways, but had to exert it when I was a younger teacher.
That idea of power is something you exert, right?
Yeah.
Like, as if this is the club that I can wield in some way. So what makes
And it
me
never
feel
really
powerful?
worked that well either, which was interesting, right? It's way better once I chilled out a little bit.
No, I just think I like what are for me some of the as I look back, some of the things that I used to lord power or hold power over students, right? Like grades would be one thing. Homework, right? If you don't, then you will. Then this will happen to you. Even what did I experience it as a student, right? A name on the board, a check mark, and that's I don't even mean to be critical of those teachers, and maybe they weren't even thinking of power. But as I look back at it now, it's like, wow, like my recess is in your hands. Like, you have control, and it's not to suggest that teachers shouldn't have control, and there needs to be a level of
authority,
right? But there were times now, even that I look back 40 years later, that I'd say, maybe what I'm thinking about is like my own response. Why did for some teachers could I respond to their, because I think it was they held authority and I was respectful of that, but when it felt like power, I really wanted to push back again. So like, who do you, and like I said, I know myself, I tend to be like that. I'm a youngish child, like I get that, but there was a sense of like who do you think you are that you can do that? And of course the answer was they thought they were the teacher, right?
Well, and I think there's some sense of back and forth, right? So if I think of myself as a young female teacher with especially like teenage boys, right? Like the more that they would push back, the more you push forward, right? So it becomes like a cycle that eventually you have trouble breaking out of.
And I think when you're younger, at least case not when I was younger, I felt like it was so elusive. Like they could just get up and walk out at any time. And I even get this question.
And what then?
Yeah, right. And you get this question even in a class, like, what would you do if?
Right.
Right. And it's like, what if someone just gets up and leaves? Or what if they say, what if you ask them to be quiet and they say, I'm not going to be quiet. What would you do? And I get that, right?
And all of those things are very real possibilities.
Those are very real possibilities, right?
To that point, so I'll tell my story. When you say, what happens if the kids get out of their like, I've asked that question of our students, future teachers, like, what power do you actually have if, like, suddenly you got 25 middle schoolers and they just stood up and walked out the door? Like, literally, what are you going to do to stop them? Right? Okay. Well, so I had this happen to me one time. Not quite like that, but here's the story. One of my colleagues, I found out later, had used me as the definition of the word whimsical, which I just love
as we still do.
Thank you. I think
the shoe fits.
Yeah. Okay. So she had challenged them, and I found all this out later on. But here's the story. So they had her English class in the morning, and then they were coming to my science class in the afternoon after lunch. And they had worked this all out ahead of time. And, you know, sometimes when the kids come in to your room, you can just tell something's going on. And I'm thinking, like, something happened over recess. Like, what's going on? They're just there's electricity.
Yep.
And they all sat down, and I was like, okay, whatever. I went on with my lesson. Well, they had a prearranged time that at some point in the lesson, someone was going to get out of their seat and just start. And they planned this, right? So it wasn't like the knothead kid who was going to, like, I'm going to sit down and get back to work, right? It was like the sweetest, most demure little girl. And you could tell, like, she was nervous about it. Okay. She got up out of her seat and just laid down on the floor. And I'm looking like, is she okay? What's going on? And out of the corner of my eye, I see somebody else get out of their seat and lay on the floor. And pretty soon somebody else. And like half the kids are laying on the floor. And I'm looking around the room, like, here's all these middle schoolers laying on the floor. So I just laid down on the floor with them. And the class dies. Like, they fall apart. They're just laughing. She said you would get up and lay on the floor with us. And I was like, what is happening here? And I figured out it was a setup, right?
Sure.
But, okay, if that had been my first year of teaching...
Right. It's a whole different story.
A completely different scenario. And here I'd been teaching for like 10 years, and I was pretty confident in my own pedagogy, and I had a good relationship with the student, and that particular group for sure, too.
Yeah.
Like, we had a good working relationship, and so we could laugh. And in retrospect, I'm thinking about this in terms of power. Like, I laid down some power in that moment for me.
Literally.
Yes, actually getting on the floor with them. But I would argue I actually became more authoritative, maybe is the right way of saying it, because of that, right? I was able to. Now, I could say that, like, you can't tell a first-year teacher that, right? Like, that's not what they need in that moment. But the wisdom of experience, I think we do grow in this, right?
And I don't know that there is any way to take a first-year teacher and to bestow that on them.
No.
Right? Like, you just have to be a first-year teacher.
Yeah.
And do the best you can and grow.
And that's the challenge, though, I think, of this whole thing, right? Because I sometimes think of it, and at a place like Dort, we talk about office consciousness, right? Like that, not my physical space that's the office, but like the role I inhabit, my office as a teacher. And we have authority associated with the office, right? And the office of a student has its own rights and responsibilities, and the office of a parent, like, we have these different roles that we play. And so there is a kind of authority, responsibility, rights that we have because of that. But we can wield the power that comes with it in unhealthy ways.
In different ways, right?
Yeah.
It just, like, it makes me also, like, I don't want to, like, a teacher does have power, though, right? Like, is that right? Like,
I think so.
And I think it reminds me, I'm thinking even as a principal in British Columbia, I had an amazing superintendent, Dave Lowen. So much respect for him. But I was, and not even necessarily because of anything he did, but I was keenly aware that he was my boss. He did have power to influence my job, the work I did. Like, he did have that, and I think what gave him authority is that he stewarded that power well. And I think that's the part for me I had to learn when I started teaching in Montana years ago. I had this power. I was 22 years old. What do I do with it? How do I do this well, right? And I think, like you say, like, you, after years, you dare to take the risk of laying on the floor. That's right. You dare, this could totally blow up, but it will be okay. Right. But in my first or second year, if I take that risk and it doesn't go well, I feel like I'm going to lose them forever. Right. Like, then that's the end. Then what do I do? And that's the part that it's like, you're always, I think, teaching is risk taking, but the risks feel so much greater when you first start. And I think that's why, without even knowing it, you cling to power because it's a way of protecting yourself. That if things go wrong, at least I can grab the reins. I can grab the reins. Yeah. And so then it's interesting that as you learn to, and it's not to say first and second year teachers don't steward it well. It's more like, I think you're learning how to. You're learning how to steward it. And I think as you, at least in my mind, at least for me, I think as I learned to steward it better with experience, I stopped thinking about power, and it was just in beautiful ways authority. I didn't have to take it; it's given to you. Whereas I think power you're taking, and authority is something given, and I think maybe that, and I think it's maybe because all of a sudden you're just more confident of who you are. Mistakes don't matter. I'll do better next time. Yeah. But everything is on the line in your first shift, second year.
And you realize you can admit mistakes.
Yeah.
And
Well,
that
that's right.
actually gives you more authority
Yeah.
than if you versus thinking you have to mask them.
Oh, because there's so
Or-
much to hide
right,
otherwise, right?
right.
Yeah, yeah. This just has me thinking too about the role of students and their own agency, because I think students do have power in the classroom too, but they don't necessarily always know how to handle that, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so that puts a burden on us as the teacher too, to like, in what ways should we be
Yeah.
empowering students, and in what ways do we need to kind of quell that sometimes?
And I think they almost, like, if they sense insecure authority, they tend,
Oh, that's when they're going to step into it.
correct,
Right? Yeah.
because somebody needs to.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's when you have situations,
Yeah.
like, because I've seen students who are in control of a classroom.
Oh, yes. Oh,
That
early in my
exists.
teaching career, I
that
had that
absolutely
experience where I
exists.
was just trying to corral what was
Yeah.
happening in the room because the kids had way more power than I did.
I remember an experienced teacher telling me once, and I don't think they were being cynical, but just like a good word from that student, a good word on the playground from that student about you will go a long way. Now, I don't know how I feel. I just remember being told that. I remember but even then, just knowing that student now has some power, because what am I doing to get that good word? What am I doing because of the currency they have? I was thinking about, I share a quote in one of my grad ed classes, Haim Genote.
Yeah.
And it says, I've come to a frightening conclusion that I'm the decisive element in the classroom. It's my personal approach that creates the climate. It's my daily mood that makes the weather. As a teacher, I possess a tremendous power, so he uses the word, to make a child's life miserable or joyous. I can be a tool of torture or an instrument of inspiration. I can humiliate or heal. In all situations, it's my response, laying on the floor, that decides whether a crisis will be escalated or de-escalated, and a child humanized or dehumanized. And I think as we're talking, and I read that, right? I think in that, Dave, you made yourself more human.
Yes.
Right.
Yes,
I think that's
right.
part of. I think that's part of it, and I think not that teachers hopefully aren't humiliating her, but I think it is really the response that there's a freedom to be yourself, right? Like, Dave, you talk a lot about this idea of like we teach who we are. And for me, it took me a long time to figure out who I was in the classroom. And once I sort of settled on that, or was comfortable in my own skin, I think then like I said, the authority was given. But it really is, I think the power comes from this realization that you're the decisive element in the classroom, and that's true. And yet, what if, I think, like, when you're younger, you're like, but what if someone else takes that from me? Then what am I left with? So, just a thought.
Yeah, and I think too, when we think about power that students can have and own, I think not necessarily power for the room, but also they can share responsibility for their own actions too. I teach a book in our applied ed psych class called Hacking School Discipline, which kind of ties into your restorative justice webinar you talked about at the beginning of the show, Matt. And I'm just going to read a quick excerpt of this too, about giving students responsibility for, instead of just punishing, which actually, like, it gives them a consequence, but it doesn't make them take responsibility for what they've done, to consider another approach to for disbehavior or misbehavior. So here's what it says. It says, restorative justice takes situations that otherwise might result in a student being removed from class and instead presents ways to teach that student how to repair the harm that was done and continue forward. This method creates an atmosphere of communication and collaboration around student issues. Every day is a new chance to connect with your most difficult students. They are used to people giving up on them and even blaming them when things go wrong. While it is important to hold students accountable, it is even more important to find the root cause of those difficult behaviors and address them. And then hold students accountable for restoring them. And I think that is what Christian teachers ought to be doing
absolutely.
with misbehavior in their classroom, right? Punishment, like, I'm not saying don't hold them accountable.
Yeah.
And there shouldn't, but the consequence should be repairing the harm that happened here, right? It should lead toward reconciliation and restoration rather than removing you and from the learning environment without any sort of reintroduction or reconciliation.
No, I'm thinking about the restorative practices matrix right now, and I don't know if you've seen it, and maybe we can put a link to that, right? And it's basically this matrix that has like high accountability,
and high support.
And high support.
Yep.
And high accountability without support is when things happen to students.
Yep.
High support without accountability is when you're doing things for them. Neither is negligence. And so this idea of high accountability and high support is when is when things are happening with them, right?
Yeah. And you're teaching them how to be accountable and how to have accountability.
But I think at times, again, coming back to power then, for me it was all the high accountability without much support was a way for me to cling to power. This is why for me I love the idea of student created norms in a classroom, because even when you're setting the rules, you're saying this is my community, you will abide. You will abide. And I don't, again, there's a time and place for that, but what about even again laying down, I want us to set the norms in this classroom as a form of laying down. I'm giving this over to you, like let's do this together. And when I was talking to Owen, who might lead who is going to lead our webinar, he at one time said, just even ask your students to fill in the blank. In this classroom, I want to be safe to fill in the blank. In this classroom, I want to be safe from fill in the blank. And I love that idea of safe to and safe from. And I think just to get students to some way collect those, share those out, I think it's such a way, like, even that we indicate, as a teacher, I hear you, I see you, I want to know you, and then collectively, hey, this is what is important to my friends in this classroom, right? Not just the teacher. I have my peers, and again, it's sharing the power instead of one person controlling it, the teacher, or even one person controlling it, a student. We're saying this is how we want to walk together in the world.
It's great.
Friends, we know that your time is valuable, and we want to thank you for joining us today for another hallway conversation. Whether it's this day, this week, or this month, we hope the Lord gives you what you stand in need of, and we want to send you from here with this blessing. So to our friends, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace, and give you peace, and give you peace. Amen. Thanks for joining us, everyone. We hope you have a wonderful week.
This podcast was literally dreamed up during one of our actual hallway conversations. Our music is by Ethan Mulder. Hallway Conversations is created and produced by Matt Beamers, Abby DeGroat, and Dave Mulder. Hey, we have a favor to ask of you. Would you be willing to rate this podcast or write a review in your podcast app? Or if you found this conversation interesting or helpful, would you consider sharing it on your social media? Those things really do help podcasters out, and we would be so, so grateful. Thanks for listening, friends.
I gotta confess, though, I was kept thinking, as a child of the 80s, I'm picturing He-Man, huge muscle bound, holding his sword aloft.
Yeah.
I have the power! You did!
Oh, man. Wow.
So good.